Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given to you by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Brad Reedy. Dr. Reedy is a therapist, an author, a public speaker, and co-owner and the clinical director of Evoke therapy programs. So Dr. Reedy, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Very honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
I gave a bit of a brief introduction, but if you could, so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your story?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this before we started. I think the best introduction is I'm a therapy client who happens to have a Ph.D. in marriage and family therapy, and I'm a therapist also. And so, I came from a family with a single mother who did the best she could to raise three boys, and I was not easy. Got into a lot of trouble, dropped out of high school, got into drugs, had some legal problems. And then one day I just woke up and just thought I just want to live longer and I want to learn. Through the course of some growing up and maturing, I eventually found my way into a class on therapy in my freshman year of college. And I realized right then that's what I wanted to do my whole life. So I run programs for adolescents, young adults, families. I run intensive programs for people who come in for five days, sometimes 2.5 days for individuals or couples. And we do deep work into attachment, deep work into family of origin. So I think who I am is I'm like every other therapy client, every other therapy patient in the world. I just happen to have the clinical understanding. So not only am I experiencing ongoing healing in my life, but I can explain it. And I think that's probably what sets me apart. And I'll just say one thing. I love the fact that I get to work with families with children that are struggling because I get to speak for the children because nobody could really speak for me. But I also get to speak to the parents because I'm a parent of 4 children and some of whom have struggled. So I get to speak to the parents who have their own pain, their own sorrow, their own grief, their own trauma, because I think parents get a lot of criticism in our culture. They have a lot of, snowplow parenting, helicopter parenting. There's a lot of criticism around parents. And this is the hardest job in the world. And there's no way not to struggle or fail at it. So I love the fact that I get to also speak to parents through the compassionate lens of attachment-based therapy and offer them the love and non-judgment that they need to heal, which will, of course, then it will affect the children and the other people in their lives. So that's a little bit about me. I should also say I run my own podcast, have my own podcast, Finding You. So speaking every week to people about all of these topics, all these themes.
Wow, that was powerful. I love the fact that you consider yourself no different than everybody else. You just happen to have a PhD, which is still big in and of itself. But the relatability that you just relayed was palpable. Literally, I felt like, wow, if I ever needed something, I could come to you just based off what you just said. So thank you for that. And I'm sure your clients and the people that you help can feel that and see it as well.
Early in my career, throughout all my broadcasts that I've done about 1,500 podcast webinar episodes. In my early years when I was younger, I would have emails and messages from people saying, I feel so bad after I listen to what you say. And I thought to myself, that's definitely not my goal. I'm just trying to teach concepts and ideas, principles, and skills. And what has happened over the years as I've done my own work, this is really a product of my own work, is just like you said, there's no difference between me and my clients. I struggle with every single thing I talk and teach about. So now I get letters and emails and messages from people saying, I don't feel bad when I listen to you. I don't feel like you're the expert looking down on me. I feel like we're all on the same page. I wrote something recently that in graduate school, it's very common for graduate students, new graduate students, to read the diagnostic manual and to start to kind of freak out that they're seeing themselves in all these various diagnoses. And professors typically will say to you, don't worry about it. It's a common thing that happens. You're over-identifying with these diagnoses. But I thought about this recently, and I thought more wise and aware professors would say to those students, instead of saying, don't worry about it, they would say, good. Now you know who you're going to be treating. Now you can see how much like them you are, because if the therapist thinks that they're different at a fundamental level than the clients they're treating, the client will feel that estrangement. They'll feel that distance. They might like the wisdom or like the teaching, but they won't feel welcomed, and that welcome feeling is the healing balm. So it's really important to me for people to know that all of us, therapists, Ph.D s, doesn't matter, all of us are in this together struggling. And my therapist said one time, the difference between the therapists, the doctors, and the patients at a psychiatric hospital is that the doctors have keys to the doors. That's the only difference. But essentially, everybody's just the same. We're struggling with the same challenges.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for breaking that down the way you did, because I think there is always this stigma associated with therapy that you are lesser of a person going in to see someone for help or to talk about your feelings or your problems. And to feel that bond or that relatability, I think will do so much for, number one, breaking up that stigma and making people feel welcomed and want to go to see a therapist for help. Because if I feel like, you're my friend, but you can help me, I'm going to feel so much more inclined to come and talk to you, as opposed to feeling like, I have to put my tail between my legs and then go talk to a doctor, and he or she is going to make me feel, bad about what I'm doing, and there's going to be guilt and shame surrounding it.
Absolutely. I hope that comes across, and I do believe it makes a difference when we can share our own story with people so they know they're not alone.
Agree. Thank you for sharing yours. Okay, I wanted to get into the interview a bit and ask a few questions. So you provide outdoor-based therapy for adolescents, young adults, and families. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
We call it wilderness therapy. It's really camping therapy. So kids, young adults and adolescents come out for 2 or 3 months, and they come out with depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, some trauma, of course, all of it's trauma. And in the context of wilderness small group living, we see everything, right? We don't have to rely on self-report on what they're saying, how they're doing. And because of the stigma that you just mentioned for all of us, but maybe more even specifically for young people, there's an inclination to hide, right? To not have a problem, to not need help. It's incredibly hard for most of us to need and ask for help and to admit that kind of vulnerability. So wilderness therapy evokes, it kind of brings up the issues without them having to relate to it. They're also able to access trauma, to talk about trauma that might be unconscious, subconscious, they might not be aware of. So we get to, I think the way it is, the best way to say it is this camping therapy, this experiential outdoor therapy that invites a really powerful focus and mindfulness, becomes a microcosm for the family. So it's very common when I talk to the parents for the first time after a child enrolls with us, and I'm talking to them 2 or 3 days later about our initial observations of their child, their response is invariably like, yes, you see them. Those are the same things that were happening at home. Those are the same coping skills, the same behaviors. So we can treat in real time what's going on. But what I'm most proud of is we don't just treat the identified patient. I call it Trojan horse therapy, where we accept the idea that the child needs help, because they do. But once we get past the gates, once we get into the family, we try to lovingly support them in their own healing. And in my experience, the most significant contribution I, as a therapist, can make to a child's well-being is to help the parent. That if I can help the parent develop skills, the ability to listen, the ability to look at their own issues and their own contribution to the dynamics, that takes a huge burden off the child. Then the child isn't carrying their own mental health and their parents. They just have to worry about theirs. And it's a huge relief to them to feel like their parents are working, their parents are growing. So even though we're a program that focuses on the child, the adolescent to the young adult child, it really, really is a family program, or maybe even more specifically a parenting program. And what I love about it is parents, because of this approach that you've already talked about, this kind of non-judgmental, compassionate approach, it's not just that we provide family work and family resources and podcasts and webinars and workshops and readings and assignments. Not just that we do all of that, but that we do it in a way that gets people to do therapy that otherwise wouldn't. They can listen to a podcast of mine in the privacy of their own office or car, men often, and where they might not be willing to walk into a 12-step meeting or walk into a therapist's office because of those stigmas. And they feel it. They start to feel like, okay, this guy's not crazy. He's not, this is not some kind of academic exercise. He's just talking about how hard it is to live and to feel and to connect and to support people that are struggling. And I can't tell you, I always say that I would do this for free. And I'm so glad that I get to do it for a living, because I would do it. I would do it if I won the lottery tomorrow. I would do virtually the exact same thing I'm doing right now, because to watch anybody but some father that I can relate to, some father that has been unwilling to go into therapy because when he goes, it doesn't go well for him. He gets kind of beat up in therapy, especially in couples therapy. But to go to that and to feel that love and to feel that welcoming and to feel that safety and then to want more of it, that's what I'm most proud of that we do at Evoke Therapy Programs, for sure.
That sounds fantastic. And I think anyone who just heard your explanation of what your program can do and the transformative healing, I mean, I can't think of anyone who wouldn't want to be a part of that, especially for what it can do for the family, the children, and the parents individually. Thank you for what you provide.
Well, yeah, thank you.
That was, I can't wait to share this. So also you've written 2 books. One is The Journey of the Heroic Parent, and the other is The Audacity to Be You, Learning to Love Your Horrible, Rotten Self. Right, can you talk a little bit about the books?
You know, the first one is the title is based on the work of a man named Joseph Campbell, who studied all the world's myths, all the world's great stories from all time, all cultures, access to every culture that he could. And what he decided, or what he figured out or identified, was there was just one story, the hero's journey. And it's the story where the hero goes after something. Sometimes it's a like King Arthur's knights went after the Holy Grail. And they go out looking for this widget, this thing. But oftentimes what they find is a more authentic version of themselves. You know, they find out who they are. And then they bring that wisdom, that story, back to the community and share it. I always use Rocky as an example. I know you're from Philly. You know, when I was a little kid, we used to have arguments on the playground if Rocky won that first fight, because there was so much excitement at the end of that first fight. You couldn't really tell. But I think that's perfect, because it didn't matter, because Rocky Balboa, the character, was changed. So the heroic parent is the parent who is willing to go on this journey and go inside of themselves. That's the hero's journey. Go inside to the unknown, to the dark cave, to the dark waters, to the forest where there is no path. And when you do that, when you go after that in the case that I work with, a child who's struggling, you come away with wisdom that you couldn't find any other way. That's the journey of the heroic parent. The Audacity to Be You is builds on it. It's essentially just so people understand this is not about being a parent. This is about being a self, being who you are. The basic premise of the Audacity to Be You is, in this work, you don't get to be right or good or win anymore, but you get to be a self, which is so much better. And the subtitle that you read, Learning to Love Your Horrible, Rotten Self, is a phrase that my therapist would use in therapy. I've been seeing the same therapist since 1999. And she used to, in my early years, talk about the horrible, rotten self. And those are those parts of us that our parents and our culture found unacceptable, found too much, not enough, didn't quite stack up. And that's also where our gift and our energy lies. I know this might sound crazy to the listener. My 15-year-old daughter, my youngest daughter, found me last night watching this on TV, and she thought I was crazy. I was watching the movie Frozen last night by myself as an adult. But I was watching it because I used it in teaching so often, because Elsa, the main character, had this gift, had this wonderful magic, which represents each of our individual gifts. And it ended up being too much and threatening her sister and upsetting people. And so she had to hide it. And eventually she ran away and hid into the mountains until the community needed that very gift that she thought was wrong and bad and horrible and rotten. They needed it to save the kingdom, because our gifts and our wounds are in the same place oftentimes. Those things that make us stand out, make us different, make us feel like we don't belong. Those are our wounds, of course, and our great gifts. So the Audacity Be You is about having the courage to become who you are. I believe the outcome of therapy is to become who you really are. That's what my goal as a therapist is. That's what my goal as a client is to become who I really am. And when that occurs, or to the extent that occurs, I should say, then we have access to all the magic, all the wisdom, our great gifts, the healing balm that we specifically, my son just talked about this on a podcast yesterday that I listened to that just dropped yesterday. And he talked about this idea that he believes that he's 30 years old. He's a marketing director of a firm here in Utah. And he talked about how everybody has this gift to give to the world. And you just got to detect what that is. You got to discover what that is. And you can only do that in a place where it's safe to be who you are, where it's safe to be the person that you were told not to be. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but those are what those two books talk about. I'm also coming out with a third one about a father and son in Utah, where the son came out as gay and the father's a Mormon icon, a religious icon here in Utah, and talking about their journey. And then I have a fourth book coming out a little bit later on attachment-based therapy. So I look forward to releasing those too.
We're looking forward to getting both of those, and thank you for your explanation of what the books are about, and also sharing your choice of movie and watching Frozen. And it's funny because I do remember watching that with some children when it first came out, and I don't think I ever really looked at it from that perspective, or I was in a place to be able to see it from that perspective more so. But it really does touch on how we have gifts and how they can be, I guess the word I'm looking for is stifled, if we don't really realize what they are and how beneficial that gift can be if we step into our power and really use it. So, yeah. So you also have a podcast.
I want.
Go ahead.
I know I'm probably screwing up the format. I apologize for that.
No.
There's a movie I would recommend to you and to your listeners called Finding Joe. Mm-hmm. You can get it on YouTube actually for free. So it's a free offering. It's an hour and 17 minutes, I think, and it's a film by Patrick Solomon. It talks about Joseph Campbell, and once you watch this movie and understand, it does the best job in the most accessible way of explaining what I just explained about the heroic journey. You'll start to see this theme. I was talking to my wife about it. I said, I think the Disney writers just study Joseph Campbell and do this over and over again because it's so obvious. And so once you see this, you'll see this theme, this archetype, this pattern in all the great stories. So that's a great one. Something I show to all of our clients and families and talk about all the time.
Finding Joe. I'll check it out for sure. I don't think there's much left that you can talk about that you talk about on your podcast. You may have covered everything, but I wanted you to at least say the name of it and what the subject matter is. Yeah,
it's called Finding You, an Evoke therapy podcast hosted by me, Dr. Brad Reedy, and every other episode is a Q&A live from our audience. So I have live participants that are watching and asking questions. You can also send in questions in advance to webinar@evoketherapy.com. So it's a live webinar broadcast that I've been doing since 2007. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, we thought with the new technology with podcasts, I'll just record it as a podcast at the same time. So I do Q&As with the live audience, and then I just pick a topic. Most of it talks about or focuses on doing your own work. You know, even though I'm thought of, I suppose, as a parenting expert, I'm really just encouraging people to do their own work. That the greatest, I was just listening to my son yesterday talk about this, and he said it in a half a dozen ways during his podcast that he was appearing on. It's all of the answers are in here. I'm pointing to my head. All the answers are inside of us. And so once you sort out this, you have a key to the rest of the universe. Knowing yourself is the key that unlocks everything else. And so the work is constantly about know yourself. And the greatest barrier, you've already said it a few times, stigma, shame, embarrassment. You know, that's really what we in psychotherapy are focusing on the most, is that, because once you can help lower the defense, the defense against the threat of being bad or not lovable or not good enough, then the information just flows, right? It flows into you because there's no defense anymore. There's no need to be good or to prove yourself anymore. And nobody accomplishes that consistently all the time, but that's the work, is to understand, to be in a context where you feel safe and loved and okay, and then you can get access to all the wisdom. So I'm just encouraging people on the podcast through storytelling, through, like I said, through referencing the things that I've studied formally in school, to help people understand that the real trick is getting past the shame and the guilt, becoming who you are, and then finding access to all the great gifts and wisdom that are available to you once you've had some success with the battle of guilt and shame. So love doing it. Been doing it once or twice a week for 15 years, since the day of my daughter's birth. My wife sent me home from the hospital and said, I got to sleep, get out of here, go ahead and do what you had planned for this evening. And that was episode number 1, and haven't stopped since. Love doing it.
That's awesome, man. And I love the fact that you have a question and answer. Now, anybody can partake in that Q&A?
The live is for Evoke clients. I would give you access to it. Okay. you can be a friend of the Evoke, but other than that, it is for Evoke clients, participants in our program, alumni of our program. So parents and individuals who have been to any one of our programs, we kind of give them that perk. And then the next day it gets posted on YouTube and then in all the podcast platforms. So everybody can have access to it. Even if you're not an Evoke alumni or participant, you can write to webinar@evoketherapy.com, ask a question. I'll answer it on the broadcast. I have 3 that came in today, for example. I'll be addressing them on the broadcast this evening. Then you can listen to it on YouTube, watch it on YouTube, or listen to it on the podcast the next day.
I'm sure for the most part, the majority of the questions that people will want to answer are probably covered in the questions that the Evoke alumni and clients have asked. So yeah, I think it would be a good podcast for anybody to listen to who could benefit from, dipping their toe into therapy, or who's struggling with anything. So,
the coolest part of the Q&A, what people tell me, because I want to be clear, this is not Brad Reedy's model. I'm teaching what the masters have taught, that created therapy: Freud, Jung, Winnicott, Klein, the masters of all time. It's a different way of thinking about life. And my daughter, who's getting her Ph.D. in clinical psychology, explains that we're mostly under a mass hypnosis, and the goal in therapy is kind of, she says playfully, clapping her hands, like to wake people up out of the trance that they're in, and to help them see that they're playing this little game, ping pong against the wall over here, but there's this whole other game to play in life, this whole other way of being in life. And so I'm just teaching what other people have taught me. I'm not really inventing anything, although they might be my stories, but I'm not inventing anything. And the fact of the matter is, in the Q&As, when I get asked a question, what people will do after listening for a while is they'll try to answer the question themselves. I wonder what he's going to say, because the thinking is consistent, right? The thinking is the same. Einstein said you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness in which that problem was created. You have to think differently. You have to think in a different way. And so part of what people get out of the Q&A who listen and aren't the ones asking the questions is they get to practice imagining themselves asking the question, because they're trying to learn how to think differently. They're trying to learn to what Joseph Campbell says, to experience and express this transformation of consciousness, which is much more fundamental than a specific skill or idea, but it's a way of being, because that's really what this work is about. It's about developing a way of being where we're at peace. I said in my last broadcast that as parents, our job is to raise our children so that they can live in the world the way that it is, so that they can live in reality, that they can have the resiliency and the sense of self that helps protect them against the trials, the traumas that they're inevitably going to experience as human beings. So the Q&A is good because I think it does a great job of helping people with specific questions think in this new way of thinking that I talk about.
I love that Einstein quote because it's so true. And I for sure want to check out the podcast. So I appreciate you offering me access to it, because I have tons of questions.
You're on my list. You'll be on my list after this recording.
Okay, cool. All right, so I want to quote you a few times on some things that I saw that you had posted that I thought were deeply profound. And there's one of your posts that literally floored me because it was so spot on and so profoundly deep. And it said, to find your authentic self, your deepest joy, the only payment required is your life, the one that you're living now. So can you please unpack that?
Joseph Campbell said, in fact, it's on the cover of Finding Joe when you see the cover of the movie, he said, we must be willing to give up the life that we had planned in order to be available to the life that is waiting for us. He also talks about, and so does Friedrich Nietzsche, about this idea that the snake that does not shed its skin will die. Part of this life is to die over and over again, metaphorically speaking, of course, to learn to let go of old ideas, to learn to let go of old relationships and old contexts. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that they've worn out their usefulness. And so, for me, that meant leaving my family of origin in the first place. The messages, the ideas, the rules, the roles of my family of origin. It meant leaving the religion that I belonged to for a lot of years. Sadly, it meant divorcing my first wife, for both of us. It meant that the mother of my older two children, whom I'm still good friends with to this day. And in more subtle ways, it's just letting go of old ideas, letting go of something. One of my favorite writers, James Hollis, says that today's instruction will be outdated by tomorrow. And what was true in the morning is not true in the afternoon. We have to keep learning and growing, shedding old skin, giving up old ideas. So it's this idea that you've got to be willing to, and the reason that Joseph Campbell refers to it as a death specifically, or Nietzsche refers to it as a death, is because that's how terrifying it is for us. When I've had to walk out of a relationship in business, for example, with a partner that I was in relationship with for more than a decade, it was terrifying. The door out of it was just 6-7 feet away, right there. And it was there the entire time, but I was afraid to walk through it because I was afraid there was no path on the other side that was going to be okay. So we have to face our fears. We have to go into the cave. We have to cross the threshold. We have to leave the shore to find the new shore. It's these messages of confronting our fears and letting go of the way that I say in that quote, our old life. And for me, that has been a profound understanding that has given me courage. And it also gives me respect when I'm sitting with somebody who's in a problematic relationship or situation that they can't get out of. I have the utmost patience for them because I know it's terrifying, and I know it feels like death. And I know it feels like no one has ever survived this transition, this change. So I'm capable of sitting with them patiently for as long as they need, for years, if they need, as they contemplate this next step in their journey, which is fraught with fear and self-doubt. So that's what that's about.
Well, thank you for that explanation. I kind of had an idea of what it was when I first looked at it, because I understand that as you grow, old concepts, old ideas you have to kind of let go of. But the the payment that's required is your life. That was kind of like, wow, that's pretty deep. And it's not your actual life, it's just the one that you're living now. So
the cool thing about it in stories is that in stories, the motif, of death is often symbolic. It is our old life. And so that's actually helped me through sad movies, because I'm a crier when it comes to movies. But in stories, when a character in a movie or a novel dies, it becomes this symbolic moment of transformation. There can be the Buddhists say there is no birth without death. There is nothing new can happen unless the old is sacrificed and surrendered. And so it gives, for me, it gives me courage as I say goodbye. I've said goodbye to friends that I'm not angry or in a fight with, just because we've outgrown each other. We in our lives, we were so important to each other at one point, and we've moved on because we're in different paths and different stages of life. And that's grief. Like that's hard to do. And for a lot of us who grew up in toxic families, or families that didn't have this kind of education or healing, we think we have to be loyal no matter what. We think we have to stay that we owe that to the other person. And sometimes, again, not in a fight, not out of anger, not because the other person is a problem, but sometimes you just move on. And I can feel that even as I say it, there's a grief in there, there's a loss in there. And we have to be willing to experience that, to experience a rebirth.
Sure. 100%. I think the way that you broke that down was very easy to understand and palatable, and can help someone who may not really know what to do when they get to that point where they need to shed their skin, metaphorically, like that snake. So I'm glad that was one of the questions that I chose, because that answer was very, very helpful. Now, what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about codependency versus dependency. And again, I want to quote something that you had posted. And it said, codependent people feel responsible for others' feelings. They also think others are responsible for their feelings. So they try to control or change others to manage their own internal state. Excessive guilt, shame, enabling anxiety are often present in codependency. What does that exactly mean?
It's strangely, it starts in childhood when our parents tell us, and I did the same thing to my children, sometimes still do when I have a lapse. When our parents tell us that they're happy or disappointed, and that's supposed to be a sign or an indication to us that we've done something well or poorly, we learn at the earliest age that what somebody else feels, my parents' disappointment, my parents' pride in me, is evidence of what I've done. So we learn from the very earliest age that other people's feelings are our responsibility. So then we go out into the world and we become susceptible to peer pressure, right? We get in relationships sometimes that are not healthy, and we can't get out of them. And it's because this training, this wiring, that people told us that what other people felt was an indication of what we were doing. And we know that's not true. At a really rational, simple level, everybody knows that they're not responsible for everybody else's feelings. But the programming is there in our culture. I didn't know I'd be referencing my son's podcast yesterday, but there was a mention about his background. He's a gifted artist. He's my oldest. And they touched on his background, that he'd had some times where he was kicked out of schools. He'd gone to treatment centers as a teenager. He'd struggled. That he had a background that was full of texture. And one of the interviewers, then went on to say, and then, you got a bachelor's degree, and then you got a master's degree. And he said, in passing, I'm sure your dad's really proud of you. And it was a main point, but my son interrupted him and said, my dad doesn't care. My dad would only care that I'm happy and that I found my meaning, my purpose in life. And that's really the antidote to codependency, is that what my serenity is my responsibility. The idea that parents talk about sometimes, that you're only as happy as your least happy child, is crazy. It sounds like love, but it's a great burden on top of a child. That means that a child is, again, not only burdened with their own mental health issues, but they're burdened with hurting or disappointing or upsetting or causing sorrow to the person who loves them the most on the planet. And that's too heavy. That's crushing. So we have to individuate. This is not hyper individualism, by the way. We have to learn to become ourselves. We have to learn to become who we are. We have to learn, and out of that, or with that, I should say, we have compassion. We are kind. We are generous. I think we are actually, for the first time, capable of real love, because then it's not based on being good or ego. It's based on, I have more to give. So we have to get out of this idea that if I upset you, I can be sensitive, I can be empathic, I can be accountable for something I've done wrong, but ultimately, I'm not responsible for your serenity and your happiness, and you're not responsible to mine. My wife and I, we have what we call marriage 2.0. After a separation in 2010 and 11, the time in between marriage 1.0 and 2.0, one of our mantras today is, I'm not responsible to make her happy. That's her job. She's not responsible to make me happy. That's my job. Our job is to come to the marriage or to the relationship with our children happy. And so we're in a position to give to the other person, to love the other person, to serve the other person. But that means that we have to first and foremost take care of ourselves. And the codependent person, in contrast to everything I'm saying, tries to manage that internal state of, I'll call it happiness for lack of a better word. Serenity is probably a better word. They try to manage other people's feelings and thoughts and behaviors so they feel good inside. And people can feel that disconnect. They can feel being used. They can feel the lack of authentic, deep connection in that kind of codependent interaction.
Everything you said makes perfect sense, but it may be difficult for someone who's been codependent to hear you're responsible for your own happiness, right? Because we get, like you said, that programming is there that from a very young age, even with our parents, that it's our job to please our parents or to make our parents happy, or even in a relationship or a marriage. So someone hearing this may be uncomfortable because now they have to rewire the way that they've lived their whole life. But to also hear in the same breath that someone being responsible for their own happiness doesn't make you a bad person for also being responsible for yourself. And I remember a therapist told me, I hate when people say, when they're looking for a partner, what do they bring to the table? She said, don't worry about what they bring to the table. You have your table, they have their table, and that's where you meet. It's not about what you can do for me, because I'm responsible for me. And I remember that analogy, and I thought that it was so good. And also the way you explained it as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
All right. So being good versus love. And I want to quote you again. And I need you to peel the layers back on this one, right? This is a big one. You said, when we abandon the project of trying to be good, we make our hearts more available to love. I have spent most of my life trying to redeem myself, trying to prove to the world that I was valuable, worthy, and lovable. As I have often observed, if I escaped my childhood knowing I was okay, I would have used my energy all those years loving people instead of trying. I would have used my energy all those years loving people instead of trying to prove I was good.
Right. You know, that's, even as you read that, it touches my heart, because it's a truth. It's you know, in childhood, I had a lot of feelings. I was angry. Divorced parents, mother working minimum wage, doing the best she could, but it was not great. And because of my energy, I was a problem. You know, I got in trouble in school. I got in trouble at home, broke rules. Eventually, like I said earlier, I got into drugs, and I thought something was wrong with me. I thought something was fundamentally flawed about me. Now, but I didn't want that to be true. So I spent my whole life trying to impress people, right? Trying to look good, trying to get the letters after my name, trying to become the smartest, trying to be the most clever. But because that's all ego-based and I wanted to be good, not knowing I already was, not knowing I was good, trying to prove that I was good, I just walked over people. And when they got mad at me, it was their problem. Even my clients in my early career, if they got upset with me, I would assume it was because they made a mistake in interpreting something that I said. Right? They were the ones with the thinking error or the twisted thinking or the broken lens or filter through which my words passed. As I started to spend time in therapy with this therapist that I have, and it's taken a lot of years, and like I said, I'm still going, no plan to stop. But as I began to realize that I'm okay, and that young kid was just hurt and scared and angry, that's all he was, and he had no one to turn to support him and take care of him and listen to him. As I started to get in touch and to love him more, and that's not an easy task for me, then I wanted to give everybody the same kind of compassion and grace that I experienced. All I wanted to do, if you know my favorite example of this is the musical or movie or book Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, Les Mis, where the paroled prisoner beats up the bishop and steals his silver and then gets caught by the police and brought back later in the day. The police present Jean Valjean, this paroled prisoner, to the bishop who's still bloodied from the beating earlier, and say, we found this man just outside of the grounds of your property with the silver. We assume he stole it. We just want to confirm it. And the bishop said, oh, you've made a grave mistake. And he grabbed the candlesticks off the table and he said to the prisoner, to the paroled prisoner, he said, you're silly. You forgot the most expensive parts. You forgot to take the candlesticks. The police, of course, apologized and left. And the bishop said to Jean Valjean, just basically pay it forward. Just take this silver and make something of your life. And then Jean Valjean spent the rest of his life trying to give the same grace and love that he had been given. And that's what happens in healing. When you're given grace and love, when you experience grace and love, and I'm not talking about in a religious sense, because those words are often associated with religion, but when you experience somebody loving you as yourself, all you want to do for the rest of your life, because you know that heals, is you just want to do it to everybody else. And so when people thank me for my work, if it's a personal one-on-one conversation, I'll often just say to them, I'm just trying to do for you what somebody did for me. Sitting with my therapist and confessing who I was for 20 plus years and having her love and see me with compassion and non-judgment and understanding and seeing the difference that made me available to love everybody else that I come. So I can talk to somebody who's doing the stupidest, most irrational, crazy thing, and I can look at them through the eyes of grace and say, yeah, I understand. I understand what it's like to be struggling, to not know where to turn, to not know how to soothe yourself. I get it. And so that's what I mean is once you have the experience of being seen and loved and you internalize that, all you want to do is give it away.
That was beautiful, Brad. Thank you so much for getting personal with that and those deep self-expressions. It's very relatable, very, very relatable. And I think that a lot of people will be able to benefit from the way you were vulnerable in your expressions and telling your story. So thank you so much for that. Okay, I wanted to ask a question about something else that I saw that you had posted, and it was, what happens if we don't own our inadequacies and insecurities? I got a little tongue-tied there.
Mm-hmm. Well, the simplest example I'll give is my mother, and she confessed to this in her 70s. She said to me one day, I was driving her back to the airport after a visit, and she said, I'm sorry. And I said, okay, well, what about? And she said, when you were young, you were just too big for me. I didn't know what to do with you. And I made you feel like you were the problem. But it was me. I was the one with the problem. And, I'm in my 40s at this point when she's apologizing, and I'd been to a lot of therapy in my life, so I'd done my work. But it was still a nice gift. And that's the best way to describe it, especially in parenting. If the parent doesn't realize that their reaction to the child is their responsibility, then they will make the child feel like the child is the problem. Simple as that. So instead of having a child that's too expressive of feelings and anger, of big emotions, and realizing that takes a lot of capacity as a parent, as a father and a mother, to sit with and to hold and to deal with. And I got to go get help in therapy or support groups or with a trusted friend or mentor. Instead of doing that and taking it on as my responsibility because I'm inadequate for this child, I make the child the problem, and I try to shape or shrink the child into a shape that will fit with my bandwidth. And the child, whether I say it or not, walks away from that experience of that interaction of thinking that something's wrong with them. You know, I think about this all the time when I watch a story about somebody who's great at what they do. It could be a professional football player, it could be a painter, could be a musician or a poet. And I think they were probably hard to deal with. They were probably hard for everybody else. My kids have been hard, and all of them are gifted in different ways. And my job, because remember that the job of the parent is not to be the teacher, but to be the student. The child is the teacher. We're not supposed to teach them about the way life is as we've experienced it, because they're going to experience a world that we never even saw. I mean, think about that today. Children are experiencing things in the world today that we never had to experience, and it's going to continue to be that way. So I have to develop capacities. I have to transform. I have to die and be born again. I have to learn. I have to grow. I have to stretch to be there to support the child. Then the child will have the experience that I love, which is Dad's kind of pathetic sometimes. Dad comes up short sometimes, but he owns it as his. I'm not the problem. That's just Dad's problem. Because most kids, one of my favorite quotes that I saw somebody write, I forget the author of the quote, but she said, a child that's abused by its parents doesn't stop loving the parent, it stops loving themselves. And that's kind of the outcome. If the parent doesn't own their stuff and work on it throughout all their life, they will make the kid a problem. And then the kid will spend their life trying to prove to the world or defending themselves against this idea that they're less than or not good enough or unlovable.
Wow. That was very deep as well. And again, that explanation was phenomenal. Also, I'm grateful that you got that gift from your mom, because no matter how much deep work you do, hearing something like that is a gift.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Really is. You bet.
Okay, I want to ask something that is a little similar, but I think it's a good transition. And this is, again, quoting you. If you make peace with your flaws, no one can use them against you. Can you explain that?
Well, if we could imagine being without shame and guilt, being without shame, if you could imagine that, and it's only imaginable because nobody's completely absent of that quality. And somebody said to you, you're an nincompoop, for lack of a more specific word, your response would be, that ain't nothing. You're only seeing, that's the tip of the iceberg of my idiocy. Because if you've made peace with yourself, there's no defense. See, this is all about a defense against being good and lovable and enough and worthy. And once you've made peace with the fact that you're beautiful, smart, generous, and loving, but you're also selfish, boring, stupid, and unkind sometimes. Once you make peace with that, earlier you were talking about how hard it is to hear about codependency. I had a therapist that I'd hired, and we were talking about her codependency as she started. And she said, well, do you think I have? And I said, everybody has it, some. And she said, after the discussion, she said, but I don't want to be codependent. And I said, you don't get to choose that today. Well, you get to choose to accept the fact that you are codependent. So the solution to feeling bad is not telling yourself that you're good. And I think a lot of people try to double down on that. Like, the the way to feel with feelings of unlovable is to remind myself how lovable I am. But really, the deeper healing is when you accept all of yourself. And then there's no defense. And then you're not acting out. And then you're not inflicting more and more pain on people because you're at peace. And everybody's afraid that if you accept yourself, that somehow you're going to become a worse person. That's not the way that it works. Carl Rogers, the great master therapist who's been gone for a long time, said, the great paradox is that it's only when I accept myself that I can change. So what I'm talking about here is this idea that once you make peace with yourself, when I listened to the Dalai Lama talk, he came here to the University of Utah a couple of years ago before the pandemic. He probably talked about, 15 or 20 times talked about what a fool he was. Because wise, grounded, healed people talk about it with a sense of humor. Defended, scared, unevolved people talk about how great they are, and wise people talk about how foolish they are. Because there's no enemy, there's no war anymore. And you can just be at peace with who you are. And that's the only way to work on yourself, right? You know this. Everybody knows that the half the battle, or a large portion of the battle, is just accepting that you have an issue. So that's what all that is, yeah, sometimes I'm stupid. Sometimes I'm unkind. I said to my therapist during a training a couple of years ago, in the right moment, in the right setting, after an hour, I said, if you don't realize that you're crazy, your children and the clients that you serve are going to suffer. You have to come to peace with your humanity, with who you are. And you have to even fall in love with that wounded, scared, insecure self. And then there's no war. Then there's no battle. Then you can be, like we said in another question, then you can be available to love because you're not spending all that energy trying to defend against this idea of what you should be or how you should be.
So let me ask you this then. In our relationship with ourselves, what is the first responsibility that we have?
You know, I was going to say to know yourself. But I think that the first task, which is really close to a responsibility, is to find somebody who can love you. And typically for me, that's a therapist. It could be a 12-step support group sponsor. It could be a friend who's wise and more evolved than you, a mentor. But find somebody who can see you. My therapist said this to me. This is kind of the funny little anecdote that's true. In 2012 or so, when I was struggling in a session to confess something I'd done or said, I can't remember what it was at this point. All my confessions kind of have run together at this point, but I was stumbling and stuttering to admit something to her. And she paused me. I'd worked with her at that point for 13 years. She paused me and she said, Brad, I don't think you understand what's going on here. She said, if you came in here and told me you were having sex with a chicken, I would assume you have a good reason, and I would just want to understand. And then I realized I've never been in a room like this in my life where somebody could say something like that and mean it to me. And so I think the first responsibility is to find somebody who can find you, to find a therapist or a mentor or a sponsor or a free support group like Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous or Families Anonymous, where you can be seen as you are. And then the next responsibility that will occur naturally is the more you're accepted and seen as you are, even your faults and your flaws and your warts and your bruises and your dents, the more you can see yourself. And the more you can see yourself and come to terms and be honest with yourself, the more you can do all these other things that we're talking about. So I think the first responsibility is to find somebody who can find you, who can see you.
That's great advice. I think that the manner in which you were able to answer these questions and the way that you were able to divulge the information was just fantastic. It doesn't seem that you haven't done a masterful job with your clients and with your practice. And I think that the amount of time that you've been doing it is very evident in the way that you share. What I want to do is to wrap it up as a final question is, I want your opinion on if someone was struggling with talking to someone about their deep feelings, or on the fence about getting help with therapy, or trying to find a way to process their big emotions, and they don't know, or they're scared to talk to somebody, what encouragement would you give them?
I guess I would say you're not alone. My good friend who passed away last year of some diseases he struggled with for a long time. He'd been sick for a long time, but he passed away years ago. We were chatting. I knew he'd been to therapy, and I said to him, "So how's therapy going?" He said, "I stopped going." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I just lie to my therapist all the time. I just spend time going to therapy trying to impress them." And I laughed. And I said, "Peter, we all do that." We all try to look a little shinier, a little brighter, little better than we are. And I said, there's really two messages. Don't give up, keep going, but you don't have to go alone. And this isn't a plug for my podcast, but if you don't want to talk to somebody, plug in the Finding You podcast and listen. And again, I think even though it's not a dialogue with the listener, it's a monologue to the listener, I think you can start to feel what it's like to be in the presence of somebody who could love you even if you were screwing a chicken. And when you feel that, when you feel like when your secret dark, when the parts of you that you're sure that if we're found out would make you unlovable or unacceptable are accepted and loved and understood and seen through a compassionate lens, you want to spend all the time in the world with that. So I would say start with a podcast or a book. Start with a book by James Hollis or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, or J.D. Gill. Start with a book. Start with a podcast. But you're not alone. Everybody feels this way. It's normal. And I would say you've just not had the experience of being around somebody who's capable of doing this work. I mean, that's all. But when I have couples that come to my couples intensives, very often it's the wife, not always, but very often it's the wife in a male-female relationship that brings in the husband. And inevitably, the husband will say to me at one point during the weekend or the 2 or 3 days, he will say, if I knew it was going to be like this, I would have come a long time ago, because he expected to have his butt kicked, to be put on the hot seat. He didn't expect to be loved and understood and given a voice. So listen, just do anything, but you're not alone. You don't have to go it alone. And others have traveled this road before you.
That was absolutely fantastic, Dr. Reedy. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for this. Thank you for your time, for agreeing to do this with me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And your body of work, I think you displayed just a little bit of it today, and it was enough to inspire someone. It inspired me. So thank you for doing this with me. If someone wants to find you online and on social media, where can they find you?
EvokeTherapy.com, drbradreedy.com. Also, you can find me. My handles on Instagram and on Twitter are Dr. Brad Reedy. And also, my podcast, Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast. You just Google my name, you'll find me out there.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for your time, for what you do, and the way you do it.